Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are. My name is Paige Eiplant. I work at Grid Arendal, and I have the pleasure of moderating the webinar today. We all know that thousands of single chemicals are entering the environment from and they form new unintended mixtures. These have unknown risks to health and the environment. So to account for this cocktail effect, a mixture assessment or mixture allocation factor, which is abbreviated MAF or MAF, has been proposed as a precautionary policy instrument. The European Chemical Strategy for Sustainability requires the inclusion of MAF, and in June of last year, 250 European researchers from 14 EU countries signed a letter to the President of the European Commission, in which they said they would strongly support the introduction of MAF in the ongoing revisions to REACH, and calling MAF a vital and practical step forward. So if you're wondering what is MAF, how does it address the risks from the cocktail effect, and what are our current knowledge gaps, I'm happy to tell you that you're in the right place. We have 5 distinguished panelists on hand to help answer some of those questions and demystify the concept of MAF. We'll turn now to Antonia Reihlen. She's a scientific and policy expert at CHEM Trust Europe. And building off what Thomas has said and his great introduction, she'll be discussing how MAF can be implemented in REACH and some of those challenges from the regulatory perspective.
Thanks for the introduction, and I will try now to give a little bit more in-depth view on how the MAF can be practically implemented. I work for ChemTrust, a charity working on the protection of humans and wildlife from harmful chemicals, and we have also done a bit on chemical cocktail effects and how to work with chemical mixtures. I think I don't need to go in depth with that. We think it is a reality that humans and the environment are exposed to many different hazardous chemicals, and we can even see that there are effects from chemicals which are in different groups on human health if there are in the mixture. So in principle, it is clear that the mixture effects are a reality and that we have a need to act. And as Thomas has said, the risks are not identified in the single substance assessments, as has also been shown in other studies on other substances than the one that was just presented by Kortenkamp. What we also see is that we have a lot of knowledge on the mixture effects also already since a long time. So first indications of mixture effects already in the 1980s. And we have had the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability by the EU Commission, which already included a promise to include the mixture assessment factor or allocation factor, as Thomas said, in the REACH provisions to address mixture effects under REACH, but also in other laws. However, actually, there's not a lot happened. The REACH revision, as many of you may know, is currently under discussion. We're still expecting the proposal by the EU Commission, which is now promised for the start of next year. So hopefully during the first 3 months of the next year, we will see what will be in the REACH and whether the MAF will be included or not. So for those who are not so familiar with the EU regulatory system covering chemicals, I have just one slide giving a broad overview. So we have horizontal legislation on the classification, labeling, and packaging, which allows or sets the rules to identify and communicate on the hazards of chemicals. So if we say a substance is carcinogenic, usually the people need to go through an assessment procedure and identify do the criteria apply, and then they have to give it certain communication tools like hazard statements, so everybody handling a chemical knows that this hazard applies. We have talked about the REACH regulation, which has different elements, amongst other the assessment that the market actors, so the producers and the importers of hazardous substances need to register the substances. And if they do that in amounts above 10 tons per year, they have to do a so-called chemical safety assessment for that individual substance. So that means they have to assess the risk from that substance before they can place the substance on the market, and they have to show that the use is safe so that the risk characterization ratio is below 1. So what Thomas just presented in his presentation. If we go a level below, we have legislation on different types of products, and we have those which are intended to have a biological effect, like the pesticides and the biocides and also the pharmaceuticals. And these have a quite rigorous regime of authorization of the active substances and the products these substances are used in. So there, the risk assessment is an inherent part and is being done by the authorities to ensure that no harm occurs from these products. If we go to the middle part, we have, for example, cosmetics and detergents, where there's also some type of risk assessment involved before placing on the market, but it is much less stringent than for pesticides and biocides, for example. And if we move on even further, there are the articles, so-called articles in the market, for example, toys and food contact materials, which also contain chemicals. And these chemicals obviously eventually end up in the human body or can end up in the human body or in the environment. So also here we have an emission and exposure source that should be regulated. And under this legislation, there's usually, let's say, a case-by-case chemical safety assessment in specific areas. For example, in the food contact materials, if a producer of packaging, for example, wants to use a particular substance in plastics, then he has to have an authorization, and only in this case, a risk assessment is being performed. And then lastly, on the very right side, you see the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, which is fairly new, and that will regulate different products according to categories. And it is at the moment not fully clear to me whether any chemicals risk assessment will be covered under this legislation as well. So here you have a little bit of view, so that we have different types of legislation at the EU level, which do involve different types of chemical risk or safety assessments. And this is, of course, important when we talk about the mixture risk, because this would be then the points where we could discuss about how these mixture risks could be better considered than they are at the moment. So how are they considered at the moment? They are considered in some products, but only as placed on the market. So the risks from a mixture, a pesticide mixture, a biocide mixture, for example. So the placer on the market is required to assess for these chemicals which are in this mixture, to assess if there could be any risks for them. What is not addressed in any of the legislation that we have is the risks that could arise from the substances when they end up where they are supposed to end up, for example, in a certain environmental compartment, or if we find them in humans. So this is generally not considered in the legislation, and this is, of course, what we want, because that is what matters to the environment and humans. As I said before, the Commission uses the term mixture assessment factor, and it has promised to implement it in the chemical strategy for sustainability. This was the big chemical strategy that was proposed in the former mandate of the Commission. So this was done by the last Commission, and it was promised not only to have the MAF under reach, but also in other legislation. It has already been said that there have been scientists, quite a lot of them, signing a letter to ask the Commission to implement the MAF under REACH. This has been quite recent, so hopefully the Commission will listen to that and consider that in their proposal. So maybe going a little bit more in depth into the REACH regulation. So at the moment, the register, as I said before, the substance producers and importers need to assess the risks from their substances if they exceed 10 tons per year. And if they can only place them on a market for a particular use, if they can show that the risk characterization ratio, so the exposure level divided by the effect threshold, it does not exceed the level of 1, so that there is no risk. So, and if we introduce a MAF, then this would be factored into that equation. So in principle, what happens now if a registrant does this assessment and he discovers, okay, I do have a risk because the RCR is bigger than 1. One option he can do is to refine his assessment, to do more tests and then reduce the uncertainty factors in the risk assessment equation. Or he could have better assumptions on how the use actually happens and what type of exposure results from it. Secondly, he can, in his assessment, assume that there are additional risk management measures that he thinks are in place at the beginning and recommend them to the downstream users. So at the moment, REACH requires that the downstream users implement the conditions of the use that the supplier tells them. So for example, if you have a substance which is hazardous to aquatic organisms and the chemical safety assessment reveals that the RCR is bigger 1, then the registrant can say, okay, they have to have better water treatment. They can remove 10%, 90% of the substance from the wastewater. I tell that to my users, I use it in my equation, and then I'm done. Last option would be to say, okay, I can't demonstrate safe use no matter what I do. And then I can't register this substance for that use anymore because it is unsafe. So in principle, if the MAF were implemented in the registration, so the companies have to identify the risk and manage it, then on the one hand, a benefit could be that we get better hazard data if they start refining their assessment, for example, or better use data. And secondly, on the other hand, we could have a real reduction in emissions and exposure, either if additional risk management measures are implemented in the uses or if the use is phased out or reduced. Obviously, the number of cases where this applies and the extent of change depends on the size of the MAF. And we have had quite a lot of studies looking at what size would be reasonable. We heard some figures from Thomas, like 10 or 11, and they go up until 700. ChemTrust actually chose a pragmatic value of 100 with 2 factors of 10 combining. So the question, what is the correct size, is still not fully clear even in the scientific community. What is obvious is for substances where you can't do a risk assessment because you have no threshold values to compare an exposure level to, like, for example, mutagenic carcinogens or environmental EDCs, you need to have different instruments under REACH to address the high concern, but this is a different story. So what is needed now is, on the one hand, that the legal text of the REACH regulation is amended so that there's a firm basis stating, yes, mixture effects should be assessed under REACH and should be part of the chemical safety assessment. And on the other hand, the Annex 1 of the legislation, which defines how a chemical safety assessment is to be done, should include the MAF and, of course, also a size of the MAF. Challenge, because I was also to talk about challenges. Well, one obvious challenge is that the current commission has a different agenda than the former commission, which was working under the so-called Green Deal. Now we have a competitiveness compass and a simplification agenda, and it is not so easy to make the MAF a simplification step in the REACH regulation as a new requirement or a new method is introduced. Although comparing it to a specific risk assessment, which would reflect the science as presented by Thomas, would also, of course, be quite complex with a lot of data needs and assessment steps. Obviously, the industry is also not so happy about the MAF. So they did, and this was also already a study that they did in the last mandate on the MAF, and tried to argue that it is not reasonable and too high a burden to implement it. We criticize that this case study is based only on 4 substances, and the cost estimates are actually only based on 2 substances. They looked at the market development based only on the registrant's assumptions, what would happen. So they have scenarios, what would happen if a MAF were implemented and the substance couldn't be placed on the market anymore or so. And they only asked the registrants what would happen. They didn't consider any benefits in their calculation, and they also didn't look what happens along the supply chain. So obviously, if a substance cannot be used anymore, usually it is substituted by something else. So all these effects were not considered. And despite this, let's call it data scarcity in that study, quite negative consequences were predicted by CEFIC if a MAF were implemented under REACH. Just a very brief look at how MAF could be implemented in other legislation. Obviously, whenever a risk assessment or a safety assessment is done under EU legislation, this MAF could be included in the same way as it is included under REACH. So this means biocides and pesticides risk assessment, but also in the cosmetics, there could be a safety assessment that does consider that there are other substances in the human body than only those which come from the cosmetic product which is being assessed. A bit more challenging will be to look at the non-chemical products, because there anyway the assessment obligations for chemicals is rather weak. And it would be mainly on the authorities to have a look at these issues. So I haven't put anything here because it would be more specific for the different types of products. But generally, it is possible and would work the same way as for REACH. So to conclude, at the moment, the EU policies systematically underestimate the mixture risk because they are simply not considered in the risk assessment processes, and as a consequence, health and ecosystems are not sufficiently protected. And we see REACH as an important starting point to close this gap, maybe even the most important starting point in all the legislation. And I thank you for your attention.